um, Tony Roy, who's a social studies teacher at the Connecticut River Academy. So these are the folks that are on today, and today should be a good webinar. So folks, I'll turn it over to you. As always, if you have questions, don't be afraid to write the chat questions in the chat box, and we will get to them. Thank you. Go ahead, guys, it's yours.
All right, let's move to the next slide then. Go ahead, Kate, you're up.
Okay, thanks. Our goals today are to look at what we define as literacy in the social studies. And it's more than just reading and writing. And my colleagues Kelly and Tony have done some amazing research on this. And we're also going to connect Common Core standards to Connecticut's social studies frameworks. Next slide, please.
Oops.
Our agenda is to start out with just looking at what we define as literacy. What do we mean when we say literacy? Then we have three specific examples connecting literacy standards to our social studies frameworks. One in the third grade classroom, another in the 8th grade classroom, and finally in a high school setting. We had originally put here that we're connecting to college and university work. And then we will have some resources for applying Connecticut social studies frameworks. Next slide, please.
Okay, what we see here is basically a table that shows the connections between the C3 frameworks and the Common Core anchor standards for ELA and literacy. What you can see here is that each of the dimensions that's listed for inquiry, dimension 1, 2, 3, and 4, aligns pretty well with the anchor standards for the Common Core. People that wrote the C3 document, the career and college readiness, career colleges and civic life frameworks, basically said that there were several standards that were at the anchor or at the base of everything that we do here in social studies, and then that actually the C3 builds upon that. And we're going to learn just a little bit more about that as we go through.
Hi, if you're looking to make a more specific connection to the Common Core standards, I would suggest looking at the anchor standard on writing, because that is the one where you can see researching to build and present knowledge. As a school library media specialist, I would argue that we definitely sort of support more specific skills in research and inquiry that are listed in the Common Core, and so that's why it's really helpful to use the C3. If you are looking to connect the dimensions and our standards, I just wanted to give you an example of what this looks like in our state frameworks. And if you would like to right now, if you're looking for a younger grade level to see the example that I have posted there, look at page 20 on our state frameworks. Or if you're looking more for a high school level example, you can look at pages 102 to 3, and there are some civics examples. But I just wanted you to see how explicitly we connect the Connecticut core standards to inquiry in our new state frameworks. When we think of literacy in the social studies, I think that social studies teachers automatically think of research and inquiry, which is why I've put there for you the crosswalks links if you would like more information on that. What the American Association of School Librarians did was make connections between the Common Core and more specific research and inquiry skills that might not be listed in the Common Core. So feel free to go ahead and browse those if you would like to. We put the link for our presentation at the beginning. When you are looking at the Connecticut Social Studies state frameworks, it does specifically state how we are going to connect the Connecticut core standards to social studies literacy skills, and we would like to tell you more about that as we continue with this presentation.
Okay, back about a year ago, Kelly and I and about 5 other educators from across the state of Connecticut engaged in this process where we actually studied literacy in the social studies for just about a year, actually. Basically, we worked with teachers from various grade levels in various districts around the state. Again, there was probably about 15 of us when we started, and the end group was probably about 6 or so. And when we began our inquiry into how does inquiry in social studies work, one of the articles that we began with was this article written by John Lee and Kathy Swan, which was written in 2013, explaining how the Common Core was good for the social studies, but did not go far enough when defining competencies needed for career, college, and civic life. There's a couple quotes that I want to just share with you. So one of the quotes from the article says, the Common Core state standards present a unique challenge for social studies educators. And those unique challenges, as described in the article, really talk about the adjustment to meet literacy demands and also conflict with other tested subjects, especially at the elementary level. Another quote that I found that was very striking was that the Common Core state standards have provided an opportunity for social studies educators to reframe literacy instruction in a way that allows social studies to regain a more balanced and elevated role in the K-12 curriculum. So this does not shy away from literacy, but actually defines literacy for a social studies purpose. John Lee and Kathy Swan argued that the Common Core provides an incomplete set of competencies. The article goes on to outline 3 important ways that the College Career and Civic Life Framework builds on the Common Core. Number 1 is to elevate literacy to meet the purpose of academic inquiry and civic action. Number 2 is to expand the disciplinary context to give equal footing to civics, economics, geography, and history. And number 3 is details literacies that are essential for college, career, and civic life. On your screen here, I basically have the 25 literacies that John Lee and Kathy Swan list out, and you can see that 13 of the literacies on the left-hand side have all to do with inquiry, so this would be dimensions 1, 3, and 4, and the disciplinary literacies would be the 12 that are on the right side, which is basically housed in dimension 2. If you could move on to the next slide, please. You can see that here's the overview of the dimensions. If you've seen other webinars, this is just a quick review. I think we've had this in almost every one of the presentations so far. So just a quick review: asking questions and planning inquiries, applying disciplinary concepts and tools, evaluating sources and using evidence, and then finally communicating conclusions and taking action. Next slide, please. So here are the 13 inquiry literacies just kind of laid out, and you can see I broke them down by dimension. So you can really see how they play out and how we are teaching social studies literacies at every stage of the game. So questioning would be a literacy all the way down, again, to taking informed action. Next slide, please. And then you can see here are the 12 disciplinary literacies, just broken out by content areas, so civics, economics, geography, and history. Basically shown here, each literacy is broken down by the 4 disciplines, and for more in-depth discussion of Dimension 2, please reference the webinar recorded on March 15th. And then we can go on to the next slide, please. This is a link at the bottom here to the work that we did on the Literacy Exchange. Again, like I said, it went over an entire year. We started off by determining exactly what the needs were in our state when it comes to inquiry and social studies, and then we worked for the entire year really doing readings and posting blog posts and discussions and resources to our Literacy in Learning Exchange, which is basically open to everyone. It's for free. All you have to do is register, and you can have access, to all of the materials that we use for this entire process. And I would say there's probably over 25 resources for anyone that's interested in learning more about disciplinary literacies or literacy in general. And also, by the end of the project, what we ended up creating were, I think, 5 or 6 literacy, actually, they're toolkits, inquiry toolkits. So if you can actually go to this link right here, this Google link that you have here, and you can have access to all of these and the literacy toolkits that we put together. And you'll find, again, all of the work that we did over that 11-month period. You can go on to the next slide, please.
Tony, could I interrupt just 1 second? I apologize.
No.
That work also, by the end of this week, all of the ones that you did and some that Kate did will be on the State Department of Ed website as well.
Oh, great. So those will be accessible to anybody.
You'll be and some work that you guys did, that Kate did, they'll all be on the by Friday at the latest. You can find them on our website too.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, if you go on to the next slide, I'm actually going to break down the toolkit piece by piece just to kind of give you an idea of how they work. So basically, what you have here is on the far left-hand side, you have, I mean, we just picked an image. This is actually an image of some materials that were created by like Pratt & Whitney back in the day. And basically, you could see here that we have our compelling question up at the top. We have exactly which content standard that we're teaching to. And if you look in the middle here, this is like an overview of what page 1 looks like, and then you can see on the far right-hand side, I have basically what each of the sections are. In section 1, it basically outlines, again, the compelling question, the content indicator, and how you're going to stage the question. So there's an activity on how to stage the question for the compelling question so the students get into it. Section 2 outlines the supporting questions, the formative performance tasks, and also featured resources. And then finally in section 3 we have the summative performance task and also taking informed action. So this is basically an overview of what any of the inquiry toolkits, what they'll look like. This one-page overview with the sources and the questions that are needed to go ahead and perform an inquiry within your classroom. I wouldn't say that this is a document that you would use to, you wouldn't just take this one pager and then teach directly off of it. You'd have to probably, you know, see what works for your students, what their strengths are, and what they need to work on, and then devise a lessons that would help meet these goals on your own. You can go ahead and move on to the next one. I'm actually going to just break down each part piece by piece. So in the next part we have here, we have just section 1, which is a compelling question, content standard, and staging the question activity. This is actually a toolkit that was designed for 3rd grade. This is created by Jennifer Murray, who's a great teacher who works over at ACES. Basically, you can see here that we have the content standard and we have the staging the question. You can move on to the next slide. In section 2, we have, again, this is just a quick overview of what it looks like. We have supporting question 1, which is what is the economy? And then we have, here is a formative performance task where they're designing, they're identifying the goods and services needed to load large machinery onto a truck for transport. And then here are some sources that you could look at to go ahead and help the students meet that performance task, which also lines up with that supporting question. And then you'll notice here that each of these supporting questions actually, well, support the compelling question. And I don't want to go too much into this because this was actually kind of talked about the relationship between compelling and supporting questions in an earlier webinar. But you can see here, each of the formative tasks are supported by these different featured sources. All right, and you can go on to the next slide. And then what we have here for section 3, basically we have the summative performance task laid out. There's basically, it says here, argument, where this is the thing that you're really going to be grading them on. This is where you're going to probably need to make your rubrics to make sure that they've met the standard of what you're trying to teach. We're also suggesting extension activities where, okay, you can take students, maybe students that are a little bit moving quicker, or a whole class maybe that wants to take their learning to the next level, take it outside of the classroom and share their work. And then finally, we've provided taking informed action suggestions in each one of these toolkits. And you can go on to the next slide.
We would like to take some time now to ask questions to the group. If you are listening to us live, you are welcome to chat in your responses. Please just put the number to the question that you are answering. This right now would also be a good time if you're listening to the recording to pause and have a discussion with your colleagues, especially if you're meeting with your department. I'm going to refer you back to an earlier slide from the presentation where we had listed the C3 inquiry and disciplinary literacies. And so those were the 25, the long list that Tony had referred to. And so we are just wondering to the people listening, which of these literacies do you spend the most time teaching? And feel free to chat in any responses. Which literacies do you want instructional strategies for? This will help you at your own school or district, and it will also help us to create more resources as we go along. And what's working in your classroom? What is successful in your own classroom with regards to teaching any of these literacies? And we'll give about a minute to see if we get any responses. Thank you. When we get to the end of the slides here, you'll see that we have some resources, and I know for making claims, definitely there's a resource on there through Odell that is very helpful. But I see mentioned here, gathering and evaluating sources comes up a lot, constructing arguments, and so hopefully some of these examples will come through in our case studies for different grade levels that we are going to look at next. But feel free to continue to pause if you are listening to the recording and discuss further with your department. Thank you.
And if we could move to the next slide, please. Thanks. This is a unit that I developed, I'm Kate, with my 8th grade colleague, Greg Cumpstone, who contributed many of the resources and helped me to refine this unit. The compelling question that we came up with, we started with trying to think about several questions that could be asked about the Great Depression, and we came up with this one. Actually, the original one is, was President Roosevelt right to adopt Keynesian economic theory and change the role of government in our lives? The supporting questions for this that we thought students would need to understand these questions in order to answer the compelling questions are, how did the Great Depression affect Americans? How is Roosevelt's idea different than Hoover's? And how does deficit spending affect our lives today? At the same time, we looked to see whether or not we would have enough sources, and I'll explain the sources in just a moment. Next slide, please. As I look at a unit, I think about the shifts that the Common Core has made in our teaching, and I find that the C3 has really helped me to reach some of the needs of my students and my colleagues in the Common Core. When I look at the Common Core, there are 3 major shifts. The first one has to do with the use of vocabulary. The next one has to do with the use of text evidence. For example, students describe how the Great Depression affected people through the words of people during the Great Depression. A woman named Vera wrote to the Roosevelts and said, "Although I'm in my 3rd year of unemployment, I still have hope," end quote. And finally, students build their knowledge about the Great Depression through content-rich nonfiction. So they're learning about history by reading actual sources from history. The inquiry arc incorporates much of these 3 shifts. We've just gone over the dimensions. I should mention, though, that dimension 1 says developing questions and planning inquiry. Questions should be meaningful, relevant, and kid-friendly. And that compelling question that I spoke a moment ago may not be fully understood by students. And so we adapted that question to, was Roosevelt right to change the role of government in our lives? And if I really need to adapt it further, I will say, if a presidential candidate today proposed the New Deal, should I vote for him or her? Question mark. So you can change your compelling question to make it more kid-friendly. Applying disciplinary tools and concepts is to analyze the connections among events and developments in historical contexts. Evaluating sources and using evidence, of course, connects back to the Common Core. And finally, communicating conclusions and taking informed action also connects to the Common Core with argument writing and informational writing. Next slide, please. Here is the list of sources. When Greg and I sat down, we thought through several possible questions, and then we made our question meaningful, relevant, and kid-friendly. And we looked to see if we had enough sources so that a student could actually argue on both sides of this issue, or rather, each student would choose the side that they felt was most compelling. We have a collection of primary sources listed at the top here, including some letters to the Roosevelts, FDR's inaugural address, which is the one where he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Greg found a collection of photographs and political cartoons about the Great Depression from the Great Depression era, and also the current U.S. debt clock. And then we added to that some secondary sources to help students understand the concepts just a little better. Next slide, please. To start the unit, we actually began the students with the letters, and the letters are written, there are a variety of perspectives, as you can see on this slide. They're mostly written at the student's level. It's good for a middle school level. And working in groups, the students can compare and contrast the experiences of people. Next slide, please. When I mentioned that this is at a good level for my middle school students, what I'm talking about here is that the reading level is at a level that the students should be able to handle independently. The particular letter here, written by a woman named Vera, when I measured it by using Microsoft Word, I was able to see that quantitatively it measures at a Flesch-Kincaid level of 5.9, which is almost 6th grade. My students are 8th graders, so hopefully they would not have a problem with that. The Common Core, though, has us look at more than just that quantitative measure. For example, the qualitative features. Well, this is a letter. The words read as if spoken, so it's a very comfortable and familiar style of writing. There are a few spelling errors, but the words can be identified phonetically. There's a clear purpose why they're writing to the Roosevelts. And there's really general knowledge demands about the 1930s. The students, the reader and task considerations, which I would also look at when assigning a reading, are that students are reading the words of real Americans, and they're looking for the challenges that are being faced. Next slide, please. Another very accessible slide, a very accessible format is these pictures and some political cartoons. I really like using the National Archives photo analysis worksheet, and I think the students enjoy it too because it makes all of it accessible to the students. Now in these first two sections, the letters and the photographs, I can't say that I'm really stretching or pushing my students' reading. That is going to happen actually in the next source that we use. And in the next source that we use, the text complexity is much higher. Next slide, please. When I say the text complexity is much higher, I'm looking again at those three different measures. I want to know the quantitative measure, that's the number, and you could use the Lexile or the Flesch-Kincaid or any number of measures, whichever you're most comfortable with. Personally, I go into Microsoft Word, that's the one I use. And then the qualitative features have to be analyzed. What's the meaning or purpose of the document? What's the structure of the document? So often primary sources do not have the same structure as, say, a textbook, which is going to give you bold, kind of an outline format, where they're going to highlight important words, or they're going to have major headings and then minor headings. So often the structure is not that way in a primary source, which can make it harder. What's the language being used? Historically, language has changed a lot, and some of the primary sources we might choose to use would be very difficult. And then finally, what are the knowledge demands? And when I looked at what students needed to know in order to read FDR's inaugural address, they really needed to understand what Vera's experience was in a letter. and the images would really help students understand what FDR was dealing with when he said that speech. And the last piece is reader and task considerations. What will challenge my students most in the text, and what supports can I provide? And how will this text help my students build knowledge about the world? And to look at that, let's look at the next slide, please. Here is a section of the inaugural address, and you'll notice that it is a real document, but what I've had to do to make it accessible to 8th graders, originally this was on an 11th grade level, according to Flesch-Kincaid, to make it more accessible to 8th graders is to shorten some of the sentences, lift out some sections. So you'll see I've circled in red a few points where I actually lifted out some sections to make it clearer. And then I've also given students some vocabulary along the right-hand side so that they would be able to look over and make sense of the reading somewhat independently. Next slide, please. The way that I work with a source that is challenging for students is to first read it aloud to them. So I would read that whole document aloud to students. Then the next step for me is to use text-dependent questions, which push the students back into the text. Text-dependent questions are not right there questions. They're questions that really get the kids thinking and talking and puzzling through a potential problem. They benefit from discussion. So on the slide here, I have an example of the text on the right-hand side. And the question that I'm asking of this text is on the left-hand side in bold black. The question that I'm asking here is, how is his idea revolutionary in paragraph 7? The problem can be accomplished in part by the government. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Explain. This is really challenging because to answer this question, students really need to understand that the founding of our country, the founding documents and the founding philosophies and the economic theory that lasted us, for the most part, up until this time, was that the government would keep its hands off of the economy. But here is Roosevelt speaking to people like Vera and people in the pictures and saying that, at this time, government may need to step in. So this question gives students an opportunity to compare laissez-faire to the increased role of government that FDR is calling for. Next slide, please. Here's the text complexity, and the top line tells you that the Flesch-Kincaid was 8.3, which sounds like it should be right for my 8th graders in January, February when I was doing this. But it's the qualitative features and the reader and task considerations that make this a more difficult text. So while FDR is speaking to the American people, some of his words are really advanced. Even though he was reaching out to them with his fireside chats, some of the language in this document are pretty tough, which means I wouldn't ever send this document home with kids and say, here, read this for homework tonight. I want to be there. I'm going to read it out loud to them. I'm going to answer their questions about any words they don't know. There are dictionaries in the room. This is stuff any teacher would do. I think that in order to understand what FDR is saying, they do need to have some understanding of supply and demand. For me, it's from a previous unit. The structure of this speech is less accessible than a narrative, than a story, or perhaps a small letter. Now, students already know about the economics of the 1920s, and they also have done a simulation activity about a family cutting back on the budget due to changes in the economy. So that piece is going to be okay for them. I think they can imagine what it was like to be alive at the time. The task is to see what is the president's solution and evaluate, is this a good idea? Next slide, please. As far as literacy is concerned in the social studies, I have students reading frequently, sometimes independently, sometimes whole class, sometimes in a small group. I also have them writing frequently in order to document their learning. It could be as simple as taking notes, or writing a paragraph analysis of the speech, or at the end of this particular unit, a culminating argument essay. In addition to students learning the context of the New Deal, students specifically began to incorporate contextualization into their writing with this unit. And students were evaluating sources in an annotated bibliography. And next slide, please. So to review, when I look at the 4 dimensions in this unit, I came up with the compelling question that students are using and the supporting questions. The disciplines that we were working with include both history and economics and a variety of sources and activities for both. The sources that we used, we not only read, but we analyzed and compared sources. Then we also evaluated which sources were stronger. And finally, the communication for this unit was to be writing an argument essay. So in this way, I was using Common Core literacies within the C3. And next slide, please.
Thank you, Kate. What I like about Kate's example there is how much she's breaking down literacy skills in the classroom. And I would argue that the same thing should be done at the high school level. My favorite thing about the C3 is that our students should be engaging as if they are social scientists, especially in inquiry. But that means that they really need to have a better grasp of the disciplinary literacy skills. And I think the most common that we probably use in our social studies classrooms would be research. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we should make integrate literacy skills at a more bite-sized level at the high school level, no matter what course you're teaching. And I think something that some of us might be familiar with as an information processing or a problem-solving model is the Big Six that came out of the University of Washington. And that would start with, defining your task, and then seeking sources, locating and accessing them, using the information, and then you get to the part that's a little bit more connected to the C3, which is taking action. And so you would present the information in some way, and what I love about the last step of the Big Six is that you would evaluate the effectiveness and the efficiency of whatever you create. And so to answer one participant's question about taking action, I think that that's a really important part to, the point of what you're trying to do with these literacy skills is, at the end, how effective was it whatever you created or whatever action you took, and is it efficient? What I've found with working with my colleagues at the high school level, we created a team that had representation from almost every discipline in the school building, and what we realized was that in order to, be effective at inquiry or taking action or creating a product, is we actually had to make the research part much more bite-sized. We're usually focusing on, we're researching for a certain end, goal, and result, but really we need to focus more on the literacy skills at each step. So this is just an example at the Connecticut River Academy of some suggested research steps. So you can see here how we've connected a very common social scientist skill, which is to gather and evaluate sources, with the Common Core. And so I'm just going to focus on step 2, which is underlined there. And again, that's just breaking it down into one bite-sized chunk. If you continue on to the next slide, please, you'll see what this might look like in a classroom, okay? So these could be suggested resources that you might use for that one skill of maybe gathering and evaluating information from sources. So again, no matter how old our students are, they still are going to need these literacy skills in bite-sized pieces. So a suggested resource from the school library media specialist in me is an interesting source called the Trails Pre-Assessment from Kent State, and that actually gets at a lot of the very specific disciplinary literacy skills of research. And if you look just at some other common examples that we might be used to, APARTS, for example, or Say, Mean, Matter, these are all things that are going to help the students really evaluate what kind of information is coming from these sources. One thing that I really like about breaking down the literacy skills at the high school level is that you are able to provide more feedback on specific standards. For example, if we go back to the other slide, at step 2, I can now give very specific feedback about the core standards of gather relevant information from multiple print and digital sources, assess the credibility and accuracy of each source, and integrate the information while avoiding plagiarism. And then the second there, determine central ideas or themes of a text and analyze their development while summarizing the key supporting ideas and details. I mean, there's a lot of skill involved there, and that's only one tiny part of the entire research process. And we haven't even put that into then taking action with it. The other thing that I really like about breaking down the literacy skills at the high school level is that it provides more time for self-reflection, and I think that you will see better results when students go to take action. They'll have a better grasp of the information, and they'll be more skill ready to take that action. Thank you. So not that we don't want to jump around too much, but I did just want to make it clear that there are a lot of other responsibilities we have as educators related to literacy, and so I just wanted to make sure that we were making those connections very clear between Common Core, our state social studies standards, frameworks, and some of our other responsibilities. So for example, with this slide here, making connections to team, I just wanted to show you in the module 3 of planning for active learning and module 4 for instruction, how specifically you could connect the topic of literacy that we've gone over today to the team process. So if you are a new teacher, congratulations, we're happy to have you as colleagues. But you know, some of the stuff that we've talked about today, you might want to experiment with it and research it further for your modules that you're reflecting on for your papers. So this will be a great way to go deeper into what we've talked about in this webinar. We can move to the next slide and make further connections to our teacher evaluation. So again, very similar to what we just spoke about for team, but if we're looking at planning for active learning and inviting students to explain the content to their classmates, I think that this is an excellent spot to do that. When we were looking at all of the 25 literacies, whether inquiry or disciplinary, if you start experimenting with that in your classroom more, it will directly connect to teacher evaluation in Connecticut. Are there any questions about connecting the content from the webinar to teacher evaluation or team? Feel free to make any questions on the chat or discuss with your departments. We can move forward to the resources now. If you look at the list here, this is simply what we mostly referred to or relied on. I know that the Literacy Exchange was what we brought up at the beginning. And what's interesting about the Literacy Exchange is you're going to see information from different state groups and what they produced that their teachers wanted for implementing C3. But you will also see many other literacy projects that relate to our classrooms. Something that I know I rely on, especially for developing claims, evidence-based claims, would be the Odell Education Literacy Toolbox. And we also, of course, just wanted to make sure that you had access to the core standards and where our webinars are and the social studies frameworks. Kate, did you want to say anything about your blog?
Sure. It's just a place that I started putting all of the things that we've been learning over the past, 4 or 5 years, both about the Common Core and about the C3. And I found that it's really been a journey as I think about how and why children are learning. And so I've got a collection of resources that I recommend, that many of them I've learned from other social studies in the state, social studies teachers, in the state. And also some of the units that I'm now feeling really comfortable about as far as applying inquiry and also making sure that I'm helping students to improve their reading and writing, and most importantly, helping students to become independent as they move forward and are able to do more research and more evaluation on their own. And next slide, please.
Okay, so this is just now it's time for you to get involved. You can follow the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies on Facebook and Twitter to engage with other social studies educators and to get the latest information on professional development. Also, you can use hashtag #CTInquiryK12 to share how you and your students communicate. You and your students are using literacy and inquiry and disciplinary skills in your classroom. And if you go on to the next slide here. This what we have here is we have the State Department of Education website here. Also, if you're interested in looking at some of the earlier webinars, you can go right to this ctcorestandards.org site, and we actually have all of the previous 4 webinars are posted there, and this current webinar will be posted, I don't know, probably within the next few minutes or so, or next few days or so, excuse me.
Tony, Kelly, or Kate, could I ask you a question? When I'm talking out in districts to teachers, and this is a question sometimes posed by veterans, usually veterans, and I'm not being negative to them in any way, but what would you respond to this? We're spending so much time on these skills that we're losing content that we need. We're not spending enough time on content. We're spending time. I hear that every once in a while. I'd just be curious to know your reaction to that statement.
Well, I could comment just really briefly just on being on these webinars. John Tully, who is a social studies teacher at, a history teacher over at Central, he would say that, I think that what's really more important at the college level is that they're able to do these inquiry skills, these disciplinary literacies, that they're able to really analyze a source and use that source to go ahead and make a forceful argument than it is so much about getting into the content. So I guess that would be his perspective. I'm sure these other 2 panelists have more to say on that.
I'd like to jump in and just say that what I found, what has made it really, really exciting to me, is that students have much better recall when they've actually spent time thinking about, processing, discussing, and then writing about a topic. So my students are carrying the information forward and making connections between different things that we've studied. For example, last fall, we did a unit about immigration that was very similar to the one I just described about the Great Depression. Today, my students, we were discussing the Holocaust and questioning the voyage of the St. Louis and why America didn't accept these 900 German Jewish people during the Holocaust. And students began to recall the anti-immigrant sentiment that was occurring to the Chinese immigrants first and then other immigrants later. And they were really making connections between the idea of immigration and when we should be accepting more people and what makes us as a nation want to limit immigration. They also began to make connections with Syria. And so all of this work with students, the in-depth reading and the in-depth writing, has made them think and make connections between our lives today and previous units that we've studied. Another example is they know and understand the Great Depression so well. One of the things they talk about is, well, if the United States was suffering the Great Depression, then it made it hard for Americans to look out and see perhaps some of the problems happening in other places of the world. It's not so much that we're looking to place blame, but we're looking to understand the context of history, how and when things were happening. And I just find themselves so much more fluent in understanding these things now that we're taking the time to really investigate using inquiry.
I like how you're commenting, Kate, about really getting deep into it, depth over breadth, which I think we say a lot But really, I mean, I can just remember my, high school history class. I just remember we were kind of blowing through it. I mean, especially, we're in fourth quarter now, especially when we got to fourth quarter and we realized that we were just getting into Vietnam, and then it was time to just kind of blow through as many events as possible. And I really wonder how much of that do I actually remember, or did I actually remember? I obviously went back and studied it at this point. I mean, but sometimes we're so worried about getting through or getting to the content that we really care about because they need to know, the kids need to know this, or our students need to know that. But really what we're really wanting to do is make sure that they're able to have those thinking skills, to be able to have those skills to go ahead and take in and learn more knowledge, not just when they're in our classroom, but afterwards.
To even get more specific about those thinking skills, Tony, I would argue that something that I think all social scientists share is this passion for knowing different perspectives and making connections. And if you control the content too much of what's going on in the social studies classroom, and I think you're kind of maybe stifling that aspect a little bit. To give a very positive example, I think, of something that's very skill-based, but that leads to such rich content knowledge, and that has been along much longer than the C3, would be Model UN. I mean, when you look at how successful Model UN is, and I know from when I ran it and when I've seen other people run it, you don't necessarily run it by giving them all the content first and you learn about every country in the world and then you're ready to do Model UN. You really jump into the skill of listening and researching and coming up with a position and trying to develop empathy for the situation that a region might be in, and look at the success and the enjoyment that teenagers are getting out of Model UN. And I just also, want to reiterate, what's our purpose? And if we look at, civics and civic responsibilities, I think that the students engage much better when they feel a little ownership over what it is they're looking at and when they feel that their ideas are valued. And so I just have found that, again, kind of what Kate was saying is when you're able to look into one topic that you're interested in, they are going to be able to recall that information much better.
Kate, Kelly, or Tony, any concluding comments?
I guess, I mean, we do have a little bit of time. I guess I have a question. Maybe Steve can answer or maybe somebody else can answer. I just put it into the little chat thing over here. I wonder about, like, okay, here's what and I'm sorry I'm kind of posing this now. I'm supposed to be like somewhat of an expert, but I'm certainly not, so I'm just going to ask the question anyway. I wonder how this compares to what's happening within AP classes. I mean, isn't there a certain amount of material and a certain amount of time that you have to get through it, and then you have to do well on these tests? Like, how does what we're saying here for, the focus is on literacy and inquiry skills, how does that compare to what's happening within the AP classes? I don't teach AP, so I really don't know.
Well, the AP is changing to a less content-based, and anyone else if anybody from Ellington knows more than I am, please chime in. But the AP is becoming less content-based. But I would ask you, the AP, what they call the DBQ, the document-based question, this is a standard of AP, where you ask a question, was the New Deal progressive, for the sake of argument? And then you give students 8 documents, and they have to read the 8 documents and answer that question using information from each document. Do you consider that to be inquiry? Because the question is not posed by the kid, the question is posed, and what the kids have to use is evidence to answer the question. Is that
I would say that
inquiry or no?
I would probably say that it's not like pure inquiry. Like if we're thinking about what pure inquiry would be, with the students would be developing the questions and then planning their research into it. But I would definitely say you're using the inquiry literacies, or you're using the disciplinary literacies to get through that. I mean, we use document-based questions. I mean, all of my evaluations are based off of that. So I live by these document-based questions. I mean, we create them, so it's probably not at the same level as like AP or whatever, but it's definitely something we're doing. So I think that these skills are really, really valid, and I think that my administration finds that that's very valid. So I think that's also a good thing, and I think that it's working out where, you know, we're finding that students that when they go ahead and take that SAT, that last part of the SAT now, which is that written piece, you know, I think that they're doing just as well on that as they were doing, well, my students were doing on the CAPT, you know, a few years ago, where it was, you know, you read a couple articles and you write a position paper. So I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, is it 100% pure inquiry doing it that way? No, but is it definitely basing off of 5 or 6 of those inquiry skills that are really critical? Yes.
I'd like to chime in here too. I agree completely with what Tony just said. I also think that inquiry, you can't just throw it open to the kids to come up with any question that they have. Inquiry needs to be taught, and we need to work with students. For example, using the strategies at the Right Question Institute, or helping students to understand what economic thinking is, what kinds of questions would an economist ask, or what kinds of questions would a geographer ask. And so I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that sometimes there's a place to provide a question, and other times there's a place to provide a context and let students develop their own questions. But I think it's important to offer them support as they go ahead and do that.
I'd like to add that what's important to me in this, you know, and the fact that it's 2016 is that we do have a responsibility, if they're going to be in a democracy, to teach these information literacy skills. And I think that the social scientists, you know, are really, I think we're equipped for that in our social studies classrooms. I'm thinking back a few years to a keynote address I heard where the theme of the conference was that students used to be able to assume the authority of sources, and now they have to prove the authority of sources. And so, I mean, if we are only teaching content and not the inquiry and disciplinary literacy skills, then what happens when they go home and they're on their internet and on the internet and information is flying at them? So we really are equipping them, I think, for a lifelong skill if we take the time to slow things down and, again, focus on research and other literacy skills, and then have them use that information to take action and create a product, as opposed to kind of assuming that they can do the literacy piece and let's jump into the content.
Kelly, could I ask you, when you were a high school teacher, if you don't mind me asking, a few years ago, did you do more content? Have you changed in your approach to this? Back when you were a high school teacher, now you're in a different role. Did you teach more content then than you would teach today?
It's funny, Steve. I think I always took a more inquiry, student-centered approach. And what we used to laugh about is, you know, because some teachers would focus much more on content, you know, I'd have some students who it took a while to really build a relationship of trust, because they'd say, can I just sit here and have you give me the information? Because for some of their experiences, that's what they were used to. And so I kind of had to work hard to get them to want to engage in the material in the way I was expecting, because they wanted me to be the expert who was just giving them the information. But I didn't feel then like I was preparing them for college or career, whatever, any problem solving that they're going to have to do in their life, adult life skills. So I even took it to the step of even working on what kind of inquiry projects, you know, fit which class. So I used to teach in a more leveled environment, and so that meant that I was able to plan inquiry kind of that worked for each course. Now that the school I'm in doesn't level, it is a challenge to differentiate for these more project-based learning. But I would say one of my favorite examples would be in European studies, working with an English teacher. The students just kept bringing up language, you know. They kept learning about European literature and they kept learning about European history, but they didn't feel like they were getting the modern information that they wanted. And so we invented an inquiry project where every quarter different collaborative groups would work on learning a little bit about language. And I think there's an interdisciplinary aspect to this that also, if you can get support from other teachers in your building, makes it easier for the students as well. But I just know that those students have said that those projects, they remember more than, unfortunately, some of the other stuff we did, just because they kind of got to invent it and control it, and that's what they were interested in, that's what they were asking for. And by no means was I able to speak all of the languages that the European Union uses, but at least now they left having a better understanding of, once we were at the point of modern Europe and looking at, so why, what does this mean about sovereignty? Because they looked at the languages, they just had a really, I think, just a deeper understanding of it. And I just never would have thought that that would have come from language, but I listened to what their questions were and we went for it. And I think they had a really good understanding of nationalism and some of the other themes that are really abstract that are hard to teach. But I went with what the 15 and 16-year-olds were asking about. Does that help, Steve? Do you have further questions?
Absolutely. No, that answers it. So can I ask you again, when I'm saying that we should work on skills, when I'm doing a workshop with teachers, and someone raises their hand and says, but kids today don't know anything. We're creating a society that we're trying to do inquiry, they don't know anything. What should be my response to them from your perspective?
Personally, I think that, okay, if someone's saying they don't know anything, then you need to pick one thing to work on so that you can give them feedback on it. And that's why I would argue that, the 6 or 7 steps that I had listed on one of the previous slides for research, I mean, just pick one thing to focus on so that they can get better at least that one thing. Because if everyone in their own discipline is focusing on literacy, which is what is happening with ELA, it's what's happening with the Science Next Gen standards, I think that they'll, then I guess to that teacher, then they will know stuff. But maybe breaking it down is the better thing instead of expecting them to know everything.
And
well, oh, go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to jump in and say I really disagree that students would, not know anything. What I'm really finding is that their recall is so much better when they've actually applied and spent a few weeks working with the materials than when they just study it and then move on to the next chapter in the book, which would be a very old-fashioned way of teaching. But that by using this style of teaching, they're actually using the information in that unit and then again later, and they're reflecting and they're building. And so my students, I think, are much more likely to be recalling the information later.
I think what's interesting about that statement about the students don't know anything is, or they just don't know enough. I think that's kind of like a values-based kind of thing, because what does that mean exactly? They don't know the things. They don't know the information that you think is important. You know what I mean? Like what is that? It just seems like a very kind of obtuse, kind of like overgeneralized statement. They don't know anything. I mean, what specifically are you concerned with that they don't know? I guess that's my question. Like, what specific things are you concerned with? And maybe as a department or as a school or as a history department or a social studies department, maybe you have to outline. Okay, these are the 50 things that by the time they graduate, these kids have to know it. You know what I mean? Like, maybe that's the way to go, because just say they don't know anything. Well, yeah, they don't know as much as their teacher, because the teacher went through high school, they went through college, they have a specialization, yada yada yada. I mean, I just think that if you're concerned with a certain amount of content, then I think the social studies department in your school needs to identify exactly what that content is that you want students to walk away with, and then figure out, okay, well, how do we teach that and also teach these skills that not only the State Department is saying, but also that businesses are saying that students need. They need to be able to reason. They need to be able to work with different sources. They need to be able to communicate what their beliefs are. I mean, this is where social studies has kind of that economic input, or the economic output, I guess you could say, that where we're creating students that are ready for the economy, ready to participate in the economy. I mean, this is sad to say, but do you need to know what year the Declaration of Independence was signed to be a part of the economy? Probably not. That's really unfortunate. So if you think that there's a certain amount that needs to be known by everyone that's coming out of your school, then again, I think history departments should sit down, they should identify what those things are, and they should teach that. But also don't forget that, that businesses in the 21st century need these other skills, right? Because we're falling behind in all of these other things. I guess that's my point.
And I think too, Tony, when you were talking about the values-based, I think I would start from, if someone has this opinion that their students don't know anything, then do some inquiry and ask them, what do they know? Because, you know, our classrooms are so diverse. If someone is coming, you know, someone is maybe in this country for the first 3 weeks and they're in your classroom, find out what they do know, because I think that the thing I love about social studies is that we are able to make these connections, I think, just to any of their prior knowledge and work from there. So I would just argue, you know, let everybody in the class share what their story and their background knowledge is and make connections from there, because then you're modeling what we want from our citizens in this country.
As always, to be continued. Kate, Kelly, and Tony, thank you very much for this. This to me was, and I'm sure to the folks listening, it was a very interesting webinar. Our next webinar, our final one in this series, will be on May 3rd, and it's going to be social studies in the elementary school. Will be the topic of the last webinar. We're also going to have 2 webinar series starting in May. One is going to be on teaching the 2016 elections. One is going to be on teaching the Middle East and terrorism. Check out the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies website to find out specific information on those. And there'll be e-blasts going on out as well. In addition, as noted before, on the Connecticut State Department of Education website will be either late this week, I think later this week, or at the absolute latest early next week, the beginnings of what we call a companion document, which will have inquiries, lessons, units, and assessments related to the frameworks, and we're collecting those all the time. So that's going to be a good section. That is a complement to the state frameworks. So thanks to folks that are listening today. Thanks to those that will listen in the future. And I thought this was very interesting today, and I'd like to thank the panelists for their participation.
Thank you.
So we're going to sign off right now. Yeah, Tony, go ahead.
No, I'll just say thank you, Steve, for hosting.
Me too. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks.
And we'll be talking again. Have a good day, folks. Everybody, we're signing off. Take care.
Bye.